Okay, so we're going to evaluate the argument for ethical egoism on the Canvas discussion board this week. And so what I want to do here is just kind of roll out the argument premise by premise by premise, and then point to some areas of the argument that sometimes confuse people or they interpret incorrectly. Okay, so now as I roll out this argument, I want you to remember this. In a good argument, if the premises turn out to be true, there's a high likelihood, or maybe even certainty, that the conclusion would also be true. So if we accept the premises as true, in order to be logically consistent and rational, we'd have to also accept that conclusion to be true. We can refuse to accept the conclusion, though, if we think either it's a bad argument and the premises don't necessarily lead to the conclusion, or if the one or more of the premises we think is not likely to be true, or we have reason to be doubtful of it. Now, the argument I'm going to roll out for you here, I'll provide you a copy of, so you don't need to be writing it down as you watch this. The argument that I'm going to roll out for you here, I think is a good argument. And when I say that I don't mean that I agree with it or I necessarily accept its conclusion. I mean that the ideas are sequenced in such a way that if each of the premises were accepted as true, I think you would probably have to accept the conclusion as true. All right? So let's roll out this argument, see what you think about it, and then think more on it, and then you'll jump on the Canvas discussion board and we'll see what we think. Okay, so premise number one says the quality of the experience of my life matters more to me than it matters to anyone else. Premise number two says, I have control of how I respond to the circumstances of my life more than anyone else has control of my responses. Premise number three says, I bear responsibility for my responses to the circumstances of my life, my individual life, more than anyone else bears responsibility for my responses. Premise number four says, there is a set of circumstances that is best for me, even if I don't know what these circumstances are. And premise five says, usually I know what circumstances are best for me more than anyone else knows what these circumstances are. And number six says, it is in my best interest to seek the best circumstances for me. And premise seven says, to knowingly reject the best circumstances for me would be wronging myself. Now we have our conclusion. If all of that's true, then this would be true. Therefore, the right action in any given situation is the action that advances my own individual best interests. Okay, so there's the argument. What you're going to want to do is look at each one of the premises and ask yourself, do I think that's likely to be a true statement? Okay, now I want you to pay attention to a couple of things, though. Premise number one, quality of my experience in my life matters more to me than it matters to anyone else. Yes, your mother loves you. We get it. Your mother or your father or your partner, your life and the experience of your life matters so much to them that they make sacrifices for you, up to and including the sacrifice of their own lives, perhaps, or kidneys or whatever. Yes, that's true. But they're doing those sorts of things by choice, right? You can think of examples where they're no longer willing to make those kinds of sacrifices for a child. So the most common scenario might be something where you have a child in the home who's over 18 and is suffering from some sort of an addiction and is, through their behavior, really compromising the quality of the lives of the other people in the household. And they may have the final sit-down moment where they say, like, look, this is it. Go to rehab or we're done. Okay? And that's a pretty good indication that your parents and the folks who love you, they're not willing to allow the quality of their life to seriously diminish in order to facilitate some desire that you have in your own life. Okay, that's not to say they won't choose to make sacrifices to maybe give up their life or give up a kidney or some other organ, but it is to say that everybody values their life. And when they make sacrifices, it's because they choose to, they want to, but we don't have claims on their lives. Okay, so keep that in mind as you think about premise number one. Premise number two, the important point here is how I respond, not the circumstances, okay? I have control of how I respond to the circumstances of my life more than anyone else has control of my responses. It's not the same thing as to say that you control the circumstances of your life. That's clearly not always the case. You only have control of your responses, is what the premise is asserting. Similarly, in number 3, it's not saying that you bear responsibility for the circumstances of your life. It's saying you bear responsibility for the responses to the circumstances, okay? So again, another important distinction the egoist would make here. Number 5, keyword is usually. Usually I know what circumstances are best for me more than anyone else knows what these circumstances are. Yeah, usually you do. Sometimes, though, you don't. You rely on medical doctors, for example, to inform you of what they think the best circumstances are for you with regard to your health, and you put a certain amount of trust in them. So usually you're the one that knows the best circumstances for your life. But when you don't, hopefully you realize that it's in my best interest to reach out to somebody who would have a clearer understanding of what my best interests really are and how to achieve those. I don't know the best interests of my life if I'm drunk or high or hallucinating or mentally ill, okay? So the key word here is usually. And also keep in mind that as with all of the arguments we're going to look at in all ethical theories, we are not including in the conversation children, people who are suffering from some sort of mental illness, somebody who's hallucinating. When we're talking, these arguments apply to your sort of average, typical, healthy, functioning person who has control over some amount of their lives. That's who our target is with these arguments here. So we don't want to try to dodge out of them by saying like, well, what about 5-year-olds? Not relevant. That's not what we're concerned about. All right. So we'll jump on the discussion board. If you see premises here that you think are doubtful, explain what those doubts are. But if you look at these and you think, this looks pretty good to me, let's hear why. All right. Fantastic.